Thanks for that introduction, Margaret. And thanks everyone so much for joining us tonight. Talking about plants is one of my favorite things, so I'm really excited to share some cool stuff with you. After this, I hope you'll feel confident enough to get outside and see what's growing around you and maybe enjoy a little wild food. So, before we dive into the plants themselves, let's just talk a little bit about what foraging is, why we do it, and of course, whether or not it's safe. So, what is foraging? Also, sometimes referred to as wildcrafting, foraging is essentially harvesting and eating plants from the wild. It's something humans have always done long before modern agriculture became the norm. The earth is filled to the brim with an abundance of nutritious wild foods. We've just stopped using them. It's really only, I would say, in the past century or so, with the advent of convenient things like supermarkets and the fast transportation of crops around the world, the foraging really sort of fell out of the mainstream and became much less commonplace. In recent years, though, foraging has started to surge in popularity again as people realize the value of local, abundant food sources. So, why forage? Um, I can, of course, only really speak for myself. So I'll just say that for me, foraging is a way to become friends with the land around you and to reap the benefits and nutrients of wild plants. The more time you spend outside, watching what plants grow when, observing their cycles and habitats, and just feeling gratitude for them, the better your relationship with the land around you will become. It's a huge source of joy to me to just go outside, visit with the growing things, and then be able to come home and create a beautiful meal or a nourishing tea with what I found. It makes me feel more anchored to place and has taught me to live in tune with the seasons and to have a gratitude for the ecosystems that surround me. I think if we want to protect the land, we have to foster relationships with it because you naturally want to protect what you love. And another reason to forage is that many wild plants are very high in nutrients, sometimes much more so than what you can find in the grocery store. Sadly, most of the soil on the farmland in this country has been depleted of nutrients, meaning that we're just getting less nutrients in our food. But wild plants, on the other hand, are growing in rich, undisturbed soils and tend to have a higher concentration of the nutrients our bodies need to be really healthy. And also, we're kind of limited in our choices at the grocery store. While the wild around us contains a huge diversity of foods, which I think is just a very nice, healthy thing. And finally, the question of safety should be addressed, as many people have understandable concerns about consuming wild foods. Of course, nothing in life is 100% safe or guaranteed, uh, and there are a few toxic plants to look out for, and even some poisonous ones out there. But if you take the time to get to know the plants around you, foraging can be very safe. The human brain is uniquely wired to recognize plants and to pick out even small differences between species. Once you know a plant, you'll always recognize it, like the face of an old friend. All it takes is time and attention. So let's talk for a minute about ethics and sustainability. As I mentioned earlier, interest in foraging has been increasing in popularity in recent years, and I've really seen a surge during the pandemic as many people started looking around for reliable local sources of food. And also, of course, people just started getting outdoors much more and wondering about the plants around them. While I love that people are getting more interested in wild food because I think it's an excellent way to bond with the land and get people to care for it, uh, there are definitely some concerns to be discussed. I'm sure that you're all like wonderful, conscientious people, but let's just go over some things to consider before you go out foraging. So, first, before you even head out, you should think about what you might want to find, and how much you will need. So, for example, like, do you need a whole bushel of wild greens? Would the extra go to waste? Just try to make sure that you have a plan to dry or use what you'll harvest. Next, take some time to get to know a place before you harvest from it. Wildcrafting is often a long game, and sometimes I won't even take anything from a certain place until I've observed it for a full year. It's important to know how abundant a plant is, what its competitors are, and what insects and animals depend on it. So, like, do the hummingbirds need it, as it's really the only good nectar source around? What butterflies depend on this plant? Just be an observer and make sure you look at the whole system before you harvest. And of course, it's very important to know the plant you're harvesting. Make sure it isn't endangered or on a watch list. A very good example of this is actually ramps, which have become a super popular forage food in recent years and have therefore been way overharvested. In many places, ramps are becoming threatened and are now on the United Plant Savers watch list. So, all of the plants I'm going to talk about today are abundant, and many are even considered invasive, so you don't have to be overly concerned. But it's still a good idea to be aware of the status of what you're harvesting. And even when you confirm that it's okay to harvest a certain plant, a good general rule is to make sure that for every plant you take, there are 10 more growing nearby to replace it. And ideally, if you finish harvesting from an area, it should look like you weren't there. Of course, this rule will vary a lot depending on the plant. So if it's rare and you see 11 plants, don't even take the one. If it's an incredibly abundant plant, then you don't have to be quite as concerned. And last but not least, make sure you have permission to harvest. Many parks don't allow foraging, unfortunately, and it's a good idea to make sure that if you're on private land, you have permission from the landowners. Most of the time, watersheds, parks, and even private landowners will grant permission to forage, especially if you let them know that you're planning on taking abundant and invasive plants. All right, so I have to emphasize this because it's so important and it ties into what we were talking about regarding safety. Make sure you have a correct ID on your plant. Foraging is, as I said, for the most part safe. And the plants I'm going to talk about today are easy to identify, but it's still important to be sure, as there are plants in our region which can be deadly when consumed. It's a good idea to invest in a few guidebooks. I really like the guidebooks by Peterson, for example, and to verify your ID with a couple of different sources. So, plant ID apps can be a great starting place, but they aren't always reliable and they may not give you all the information you need. It's also not a bad idea to do a quick internet search for poisonous plants that may be growing in your area and just familiarize yourself with them. And of course, if you're in doubt about something, just skip it. If you have a bad feeling about a plant or you aren't 100% sure, it's much better to just leave it for another time and not take any risks. Okay, so these are just a few more things to consider before harvesting. It's important to know the place you're harvesting from and to make sure it has not been sprayed with chemicals. Even if it's your own backyard, be sure that it hasn't been sprayed with chemicals for at least 3 years before you harvest anything from it. It's also a good idea to make sure you aren't harvesting too close to a road or railroad tracks, as pesticides are often used there and the pollutants can run off from the soil and into the plants. Just try to find a spot that I would say ideally is at least 50 feet from roads and railways. And when you find a good spot, it's also a good idea to just, take only healthy looking plants. I'm sure that goes without saying, but you don't want to eat plants that have been half eaten by bugs or trampled on. Um, and lastly, when you're trying a new wild food, just eat a small amount of it to make sure it agrees with you. Because it's new to you, you may not realize you have a certain allergy or sensitivity, and it's just better to be on the safe side. All right, so here is some equipment to consider if you want to start foraging. Of course, it's not necessary to have any fancy equipment. A pair of shears or scissors or just a paper bag to collect things in is fine. But these are things that can make for a better experience. Make sure you have clean, sharp shears or scissors, as clean cuts can help prevent injury to a plant and just give it a better chance at staying healthy. You might also want something to store your harvest in, as well as a pair of gloves, and as I mentioned earlier, a good field guide, and also a sharp spade for digging. I use a hori hori knife, which is a Japanese style gardening knife, as it's very sharp and good for digging and even in a pinch, cutting. Okay, so administrative stuff out of the way. Now we can finally talk about the fun stuff, which is the plants. Stinging nettle. So when I see the nettle popping up, I know spring is really here. Nettle is one of the first things I harvest, and it's definitely one of the best. It's absolutely packed with nutrients, which is just what our bodies need after a long winter of heavy foods and a more sedentary lifestyle. It contains a high concentration of chlorophyll, iron, calcium, other trace minerals, vitamins, and even protein. In herbalism, we actually refer to this plant as an alterative, which means that it brings the body into alignment and helps it function more smoothly by gently building up health. So to ID, nettle has crinkly, toothed opposite leaves, and it's covered in tiny hairs that sting. It prefers full sun and likes to be near the water. Identifying nettle is actually very easy because if you touch it, you will feel a sting. The tiny hairs on the leaves and stem contain formic acid, which is actually the same chemical that makes bee stings hurt. Though the pain is not nearly as bad or prolonged as a bee sting, it's definitely there. Um, in fact, it's kind of odd, but some people practice what is known as urtification. Essentially, they use nettle, urtica, thus urtification, to increase blood flow and therefore healing to a certain area by purposely stinging themselves with nettle. Um, there are definitely mixed reviews on how well this works, but some people swear by it, so I thought it was worth mentioning. I think it's pretty interesting. All right, so I realize nettle may seem a little intimidating based on this information, but it's absolutely worth it. And honestly, you can just throw on some gloves when you go to harvest it and you'll be fine. I should also mention that the formic acid starts to rapidly die away soon after harvest or when you cook it, so you don't have to be concerned about that. So the best way to collect this plant is to snip off the top thirds. This ensures that you're going to get the most tender part of the plant, while also allowing it to continue growing so you can come back for later harvests. So one caveat here is to make sure that you only harvest from this plant in the spring. As soon as you see little seeds starting to form beneath the leaf stems, just leave it be. While it hasn't exactly been confirmed, many people say that after the seeds form, nettle can be a bit irritating to the gastric system. So it's better to just be on the safe side. So the thing I personally use nettle for the most is a tea, or rather a nourishing green infusion. That is, I steep the dried leaf in hot water for around 8 hours and then drink it, usually over ice. It has a gorgeous emerald green color, and you can just taste the delicious earthy minerals. Maybe it's not for everyone, but to me, it's really refreshing and energizing. You can also use the powdered dried leaves as a sort of vitamin-rich powder and add that to smoothies. Um, I've actually used it the same way as you would use matcha powder, like green tea matcha powder, with really good results. And the fresh tops of nettle can be used much like you would any other green. It's really wonderful, just sautéed with a little olive oil, salt, and lemon juice. You can also add it as a topping to your pizza, or you can turn it into a nutritious, delicious pesto. Okay, so here's a plant that should be familiar to everyone. Poor dandelion always gets such a bad rap for being a persistent weed, and many people spend hours and lots of money trying to eradicate it from your yards. But I say if you can't beat them, eat them. The tender spring leaves are an excellent bitter. So the bitter flavor is something that's largely missing from the American diet, which is a shame because it's very important to digestive health. Essentially, what the bitter flavor does is it sends a signal straight to your brain to fire up the digestive system, which makes it easier to digest your meal. This is actually why eating salads before dinner was always a thing. They were traditionally sprinkled with bitter plants that help to prime digestion and increase appetite before a meal. Many people may not initially love the taste of bitter plants like dandelion, but it does tend to grow on you, and it's really just great for your health to incorporate them into your diet. So yeah, the whole plant is edible. The flowers and roots of this plant, you can eat them. The root is bitter, especially in the spring, while the flowers have a lighter, sweeter flavor than the roots or leaves. Um, because dandelion has such a cleansing effect on the digestive system and therefore the body, it's often referred to as a spring tonic. This is a common theme you'll notice with many spring edibles. They pop up just in time to get our bodies going for the warm, more active months ahead, and they help us shake off some of that sluggishness of winter. Because this plant is so common, I'm sure most of you will have no trouble identifying it, but yeah, it has toothed leaves that grow from a basal rosette. The yellow flowers spring up from the ground on a slender, hollow stem. So to harvest dandelion, just snip off the leaves and flowers. If you're after the root, I recommend a sharp spade for really wiggling down into the dirt and prying up the root. Um, the one thing about dandelion roots is they are much more bitter in the spring than they are in the fall. By the fall, especially after the first frost, the inulin content, which is essentially a prebiotic sugar, has risen substantially and makes for a much sweeter root. So, if you're harvesting dandelion root for its medicinal effects as a bitter, the spring is a good time to harvest. But if you're after sweeter roots for making a tasty tea or for roasting the roots, then the fall is your best bet. So, how to use? The greens are delicious fresh, but they're also really wonderful when you saute them. The flower heads can be eaten raw in salads. You can bake them into cookies, or you can even batter them and fry them to make dandelion fritters. The roots can be chopped up, dried, and most often are used to make a decoction, which is a very strong herbal tea. And they can also be roasted. The roots can be roasted, and you can grind them up and make a drink that's actually very similar to coffee, but without that caffeine high. Violets. You know, I've been foraging for years, but I still get excited by the fact that these beautiful flowers are edible. The tender new leaves of violet are demulcent, meaning that they have a slightly gooey moistening quality, and they're very rich in vitamin C and A. Herbalists will actually often dry the leaves and flowers of violet and use it as a moistening tea for scratchy throats and other dry conditions. Violets tend to grow in clumps of heart-shaped leaves that slowly uncurl in the spring. The flowers are five-petaled. They have a dash of white in the center, and they grow from a single stem. And also, depending on the species, you may also see white flowers with a purple center. To harvest the violets, just snip a few leaves and flowers per clump. This ensures that they'll thrive again next year. You can add the tender leaves to salads. Uh, you can put them in soups, which because they're kind of gooey, they can thicken up a soup really nicely. And you can toss them into pastas too. I would just note that like while the leaves are okay when they're more mature, they tend to get a little tough and stringy, which is not really my thing, but they're still good. Just maybe not for everyone. And of course, as I said, they can also be dried and brewed into tea. The flowers can be eaten raw as well, but they're often candied or used to make jelly or turned into a beautiful, vibrant flower syrup, which this is probably my favorite recipe from the little ebook that you're all gonna get, because this chemical reaction happens when you add lemon juice in the last step that turns the syrup from blue to a bright fuchsia. It's just really cool to see, and everyone should try it at least once. So conifer tips. Yes, you can eat pine needles. um, and you can actually harvest needles from conifers all year round. But the spring is when they put out this really tender new growth that's just totally delicious and it's so vibrant. The tips have a bright citrusy flavor and they're also very high in vitamin C. My favorite varieties to forage are Norway spruce, blue spruce, Fraser fir, and Douglas fir, which Douglas fir is a West Coast species, but you can find it sometimes in certain landscape areas. So keep an eye out. Okay. So I don't want to digress too far because IDing conifers at the species level is a whole thing, but I do want to share some very basic tips to help you figure out what you're looking at. Spruce needles are attached to the branch by these little woody projections, as you can kind of see there in the first picture. They're also a bit sharper and tougher than fir needles, and they have a slightly square shape. Fir needles are softer, they're flatter, and they're attached to the branches by what look like little tiny suction cups. And of course, pine needles are long and they tend to grow in groups from a single projection that's attached to the branch. And also one note, I just have to make sure you know it's important to make sure that you don't harvest yew, which is an evergreen species that is toxic. So definitely do some Googling, make sure you can identify yew, and then you don't have to worry about it. So to harvest these delicious little green gems, just take a sharp, clean pair of shears and snip them off right where they meet the branch. Make sure you only take a few, as this is the new growth of the tree. And over-harvesting will mean less growth, or in the extreme, the stunted growth of the tree. So if you want more than a few tips, try to harvest them from multiple trees to lessen the impact. Conifer tips have so many uses. Because they make such a nice seasoning, you can just try experimenting with adding them to lots of different dishes and baked goods. I like to chop them up and brew them into a tea. I blend them in a spice grinder with sugar to create a sweetener. And I even cook them into a syrup. And you know what? You can add them to cookies too. Really, it's just so versatile and it's something you can have a lot of fun experimenting with. Okay, mulberries. So maybe a little early yet for mulberries, but I just wanted to include them because they're one of my favorites. Mulberries are really delicious and they're actually rich in iron, protein, potassium, vitamins E, K1, and C. Mulberries can reach about 80 feet tall, depending on the species. The berries of all species are edible, and the leaves are a nice deep green color, and they're like a little bit leathery. They're also polymorphic, which means that the leaves have different shapes on the same tree. So some will have a mitten shape, some may have like a few deep lobes, and some are just more plainly heart-shaped. This makes it a little easier to ID even without the berries. But of course, the best way to be sure you're looking at a mulberry is to see those blackberry-shaped berries that start to ripen right near the end of spring. So mulberries can be picked as they ripen. I suggest bringing a hard-sided container with you when harvesting, as the berries are very delicate and tend to burst and fall apart easily. I know this because the first time I came across a mulberry tree, all I had with me was a brown paper lunch bag. And let's just say that it did not end well. Um, because the berries are so fragile, it's a good idea to store them in the fridge and just use them sooner rather than later. Of course, you can freeze them too if you think it might be a while before you get to them. As I said, mulberries are amazing right off the tree, but really you can use them anywhere you would use fresh berries. One of my favorite things to do is to harvest a bunch of mulberries right on Midsummer's Day. In my experience, that's right when they tend to hit their peak ripeness, right at the end of June. And I make these really decadent, delicious scones. There's just something really magical about these berries. I don't know what it is, but eating them in a feast feels like a perfect way to celebrate the summer. Okay, cleavers. This is a fun one. Um, so also called goosegrass, catchgrass, sticky weed, and hitchhiker, cleavers have a sweet, fresh green flavor. They make an excellent spring tonic because they have a moving, cleansing effect on the lymphatic system. They encourage lymphatic flow, and they sort of help to keep your body clear and support your immune system as it flushes out toxins and pathogens. Cleavers is a plant that's kind of easy to ID because of how distinct it is. The undersides of the whorled leaves have a texture kind of like Velcro, and they will stick to everything they touch. They like to grow in spreading mats low to the ground, and the flowers are very tiny and white, and they should be flowering right around now. So to harvest cleavers, just give them a trim by snipping off the aerial parts. I usually take just the top thirds. Because the texture of cleavers makes them really unappetizing, because I don't think anyone really wants to eat Velcro, um, they're really something that's best when made into a drink or you can juice them. Because they're so high in water and chlorophyll, drying them out leaves you with almost nothing. So this is definitely a plant that I would suggest using fresh. One of my favorite for springtime drinks is to actually just take a big handful of cleavers, give them a rough chop, and add them to a mason jar. Then cover it with cold water and let it infuse overnight. Then just strain it out and drink it over ice. It's like really, really cooling, very refreshing, and I always feel energized after I've had a glass. Chickweed. So chickweed is like a very juicy, fresh spring green that likes to grow in cool, shady spots. It has almost a salty flavor, and it's delicious just to snack on. Like cleavers, herbalists tend to use chickweed as a gentle, cooling lymphatic mover and a spring tonic. Chickweed grows low to the ground in mats, and it has plump little opposite leaves, a hairy stem, and produces these very unique, small, white, 10-petaled flowers. Once you recognize it, you'll probably start seeing it everywhere. It's very common. So to harvest chickweed, just snip off the tops. We herbalists like to say that chickweed loves a haircut. So giving it a little trim can actually encourage growth if you don't take too much. Like cleavers, chickweed doesn't dry or store very well as it's got a high water content, so it's best used as fresh as possible. It adds a delicious freshness to salads or on sandwiches, and you can brew it into a tea. I like to make a strong infusion by covering a big handful of it in hot water and just letting that steep about 8 hours, and then I'll drink it over ice. Okay, so do you remember finding those little mini onions in the yard when you were a kid? and wondering if you could eat them, well, you can. Um, People always get so excited when they find out how delicious and fun this little wild onion is. The tops can be used just like you would chives, and the little bulbs remind me of something like a cross between an onion and a garlic clove. They grow in clumps and have hollow leaves, again, very similar to chives. And the small underground bulbs are coated in a thin papery layer that you can just peel off before using. The main important identifying feature here is that they should smell very strongly of onion. So to harvest field garlic, just snip off the tops if that's all you're after. But if you want to harvest the bulbs, use a sharp spade to gently dig down around the clump and just loosen up the earth until you can pull them cleanly out. So, as I said, you can use these anywhere you use chives. I like to toss a big handful into my rice, my pasta. You can put it in dips. Really, there's so many options. And the little bulbs are great anywhere you want an interesting garlicky flavor. They'd be great tossed in with sauteed greens, or if you're a person that eats fish or meat, you can make a nice sauce. Um, they're just so versatile and abundant. They're really one of my favorite forage foods. All right. So also called basswood, if referring to our native species, or across the pond, they actually call these lime trees. Linden is a deciduous tree that produces flavonoid-rich, honey-scented flowers. And both the flowers and the leaves are edible. Lindens can vary in size based on the variety. So our native American basswoods tend to grow very tall, around 80 feet, and they have these big, broad, heart-shaped leaves. Smaller European varieties are very popular in landscaping, so you have a good chance of finding one in a park or even right in the city. They don't grow as tall, and the leaves are much smaller. I actually harvest almost exclusively from these varieties because they're just easier to reach, as they only grow about 40 feet tall. Unless they're very young, it's really hard to reach up and harvest from American basswoods. I think they just like to keep their flowers way up high, only for the bees. But when in doubt, yeah, it's probably the best way to get a positive idea on a linden is to wait for the blooms, which are very distinct. The flowers look like little fireworks, and they have very long, pale green bracts. And they also smell very sweet, a little bit like honey. So to harvest the leaves, just collect a few here and there. Remember that the tree needs them for energy, so don't take too many. And try to take just a few from multiple trees if you can, instead of a bunch from one tree. The same goes with the flowers. If you can find more than one tree, that's great. I will note it's also best to keep a close eye on the flowers and harvest them just as they open. They have a relatively short window before they begin to turn brown and they become like a little unappealing. Usually that's about a week, so you have to be quick. And also be aware that when you're harvesting, you're almost guaranteed to be completely surrounded by all sorts of bees. So make sure you're comfortable with that. They just really love linden flowers, and on a sunny day, the whole tree will be humming. So the young leaves and flowers, as I said, can both be eaten raw. The young leaves have a really interesting, sweet snap pea kind of flavor, and they're really nice right off the tree or tossed into a spring salad. The flowers are edible as well, although I usually save them for a tea instead of eating them. Um, Linden is another plant that I like to brew into a very long infusion. So I'll typically go out in the morning, I'll collect the flowers, and then I'll steep them all day, and then drink it in the evening. It just has a very relaxing, cooling, calming effect, and it tastes very nice and sweet. And it's just extra nice after a hot day. Herbalists often actually suggest this as a cardiotonic, as it is believed to open up and relax the circulation around the heart which helps it beat a little easier, and that's what gives you that nice relaxed feeling when you drink this tea. Okay, guys, one more edible flower. um, so red clover is a wildflower that thrives in sunny meadows and starts to bloom right at the beginning of June. They have a mild, almost vanilla-like flavor, and they're really rich in potassium, iron, magnesium, calcium, manganese, and isoflavones. Red clover likes to grow around 1 to 2 feet tall, and it has very light to sometimes very vividly pink terminal inflorescences. If you look closely, you'll actually see that each flower head is made up of lots of tiny little flowers. And the leaves have 3 parts, and they have a very distinct white chevron marking. So to harvest red clover, you just pop the flower heads right off. You can also snip them, of course, along with the topmost leaves. Um, Honestly, the most important thing to know about harvesting red clover is that it's best to do it when they're dry. So if they're too damp, they tend to grow this little fuzzy white mold. Just keep an eye out from this, and also try to avoid flowers that appear brown or look like they're a little bit past their prime, as they're more likely to grow the mold. And I'm pretty sure no one wants to eat the mold. um, well, I'm sure it wouldn't kill you. Consuming it on the clover is thought to have a slightly blood thinning effect, which is not ideal for people who are taking things like Coumadin or other blood thinners. So just make sure you're dry, that they're dry, and if you're going to dry them for tea, spread them out on a drying rack or in a dehydrator as soon as you can when you get home, especially if you're in a humid climate. So, as I said, red clover makes a nice trail snack. They can be eaten raw, and they look really pretty tossed in salads. Um, and I like to take them and infuse them in apple cider vinegar uh, to really reap the benefits of all the nutrients the flowers contain. It makes a really nice salad dressing, actually. And of course, it makes a really lovely, tasty infusion. All right, so let's move on to our last plant. Couldn't do a spring edibles talk without garlic mustard. So, garlic mustard is very, very prevalent throughout our area. Like, really, it's everywhere, and it can take over whole areas and even push out other plants. But lucky for us, it's a nutritious member of the brassica or cabbage family. So, we can just eat it to beat it. It was actually originally grown as a food crop in Europe. So essentially, it's a garden escape. It has a bitter flavor that's, I would say, maybe not for everyone, but many people absolutely love it. As I mentioned earlier, that bitter flavor is so important for a healthy digestion. So garlic mustard has opposite toothed leaves that sharpen into a point the older the plant gets. And it produces tiny white flowers in early summer. And also, when you crush the leaves, you'll notice a very pungent garlicky smell. To harvest garlic mustard, you can snip off the upper parts if you want to, but I suggest just pulling it right out, root and all. Forget all the rules we talked about around sustainability. This plant really does spread like wildfire, and pulling out the whole thing is only going to do the ecosystem a favor. So as I said, the leaves have a strong bitter flavor. They are nice tossed in salads in small quantities. You can saute them as greens. You can whip them up into a nice pesto. As they're a little sharp, some people might prefer to add like basil or more mild green to their pesto to take the edge off. And actually, the roots have a nice warming, spicy quality, and they can actually be dried and ground up and used as a spice. They taste, to me, almost like a very mild wasabi. I actually like to take the root powder and mix it into a cracker dough. It makes for a really interesting little zing of flavor. overall, yeah, this is such a versatile plant, and I love that you can just harvest as much of it as you want without feeling bad. Okay, so that's it, friends. This is just a little legal bit that I have to include just in case, even though you're all lovely, responsible people. Just, make sure to do your own research on wild plants before consuming them. And again, make extra, extra sure you have a correct ID before you try anything. All right, so here's my contact info in case anyone has to or wants to reach out with some questions. Um, my website is for my skincare business. I'm not trying to plug it or anything weird like that. I just put it in here because I have a lot of stuff on the blog about herbs and foraging if you guys are interested and want to look some stuff up. And also, before I wrap up, I really just want to give a shout out to Wissahickon Trails for inviting me to give this talk, which I've really enjoyed. And I just want to point out that the unique, holistic way that they manage their preserves is really special. They try to minimize the use of chemicals, which can be difficult to do and which is still very rare in the world of land management. Personally, I think they're leading the way in terms of what we need to do to cultivate truly healthy ecosystems and take care of the earth. I feel confident that the plants that you respectively harvest on those lands will be clean and nutritious. But of course, before you go out harvesting, if you have any questions about whether or not a site is safe to harvest from, you can just reach out to them and they will direct you, let you know. Okay, so thanks again. And now I will attempt the technology and turn this back over to Margaret.
Thank you. That was great.
Okay, we're back.
Well, so we don't have many questions in the chat. The last one is a good one, though. It's how to identify fiddlehead ferns. Are all young fern heads edible?
So, oh gosh, this is a loaded question. Because with fiddlehead ferns, you have to cook them in a certain way to make sure that you remove the toxins. Otherwise, you could get a little bit sick from them. And there are some species of ferns that you just want to avoid. I think when most people are talking about eating fiddlehead ferns, they're probably talking about ostrich ferns, which tend to be a little bit safer. And I would say before you harvest any fiddleheads, just be very sure of your ID. And also definitely look up some recipes and make sure that you're cooking them in the right way. Usually, I think it takes like a few changes of water that you have to boil them in to kind of leach out any chemicals that you don't want. So yeah, I would say just make sure you have a correct ID and look up how to cook that particular fern.
Yeah, I made the mistake once of seeing some fiddleheads, and I was like, I didn't research it beforehand, so I took a few of them, and then when I got home, I Googled it, and I read some stuff that was like, ostrich fern. If you don't have that, you shouldn't eat it. So I came very close to making that mistake.
It's easy to make because they're so popular and you see it all over social media that everyone's eating the fiddleheads, but sometimes the details get lost, you know?
Yeah. I will say that it can feel scary when you first start foraging for reasons like that because you feel like one misstep and you could die. But honestly, it's not, doesn't have to be that scary.
No, just like I said, try a small amount. Make extra sure you know what you're looking at. And if you have any uneasy feelings about it, it's just better to not. It's just better to not. Be on the safe side.
Yeah.
But I don't want to scare anybody. I mean, as soon as you recognize plants and you know you have a good ID, then you're fine because honestly, most plants out there at the most would probably make you a little nauseous. There's very few plants that would kill you.
Well, it's comforting.
Yeah.
Everyone, you have a few seconds if you want to ask more questions. This is your chance.
And like, no question is too stupid. When I started, like, I'm pretty much self-taught. I had no idea about anything. So no one's gonna judge you.
Do I have to write my question or can I just ask it?
You can ask it.
Just ask it.
So I understand people's anxiety about pesticides and essentially it's a poison. So if I go picking dandelions in a field, I might worry about if it's being sprayed. But when you get to plants that are sort of in lowland areas near water, where these ground should one be worried about other things in the soil? There won't be pesticides probably down by a river, but should one be concerned with the water quality or the soil itself?
I would say I wouldn't worry too much about the soil itself because most of the things in the soil are not gonna bioaccumulate the same way as pesticides. The main reason we worry about pesticides is that they can build up in the body, so it's better to just stay away from them. And I would say this is also dependent on the water source. So this comes back to knowing the area that you're foraging in. I mean, there's some places on the Mississippi River that I probably wouldn't forage. But if it's a small river, or even if it's like the Wissahickon, for example, I think I would feel comfortable foraging there because most of the pollutants that you would find in the water will probably be filtered out by the soil. So I don't think I'd be too concerned about it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have another question. Can you recommend a book for starters to refer to?
I really like the Peterson Guide to Edible and Medicinal Plants. And that's just really good for IDing the plants because they have really good pictures and ID tips. So that's something that I would just go out with, look at the plants, kind of make sure I had a good ID and go from there if you're just starting out.
I wonder if we should say something about plant ID apps and
Oh, yeah.
benefits and risks therein.
Yeah, I think I like touched on it for a second, but it's definitely worth talking about for a minute because like for example, I use iNaturalist when I see something I don't know. I think it's a really good starting place. But the key is to make sure that once you have that starting place, you verify it somewhere else. So if you ID something in iNaturalist, then I would just give that plant a quick Google and look at the images and see like, does this exactly match up? Just to be sure. Because so I think I've taken a picture of my dog and it says, oh, this is a black bear. So you just need to be sure. Just verify it with another source.
True.
But definitely use them because it's a really good starting place. If you have no idea, it's a great place to start.
And we have another question. Is nettle also known as 7-minute itch?
I've never heard that,
I think
but
maybe I have.
that sounds right.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely can be a little itchy if you get stung. That's funny. I like that.
All right. I think that's a wrap. It's about 8 o'clock. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Alison, for an awesome presentation. It's
Yeah,
really
thanks
great.
for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alison.
All right. Thank you guys.
Thanks so much.
Have a good night, everybody.
Appreciation. Well done.
Thank you, Alison.
Thank you.